the microphone. So please let me know if I forget what. Okay, I'm deeply honored to be here in Brazil. I am enjoying myself immensely, and I must say that I think it's the first time that I do a presentation like this in shorts. So I hope you accept my shorts. All right. So I will present to you a work in progress. It builds on old ideas of mine, but the framework is kind of new, so I will be very, very interested in hearing comments and criticism afterwards, so that I can improve my work. Okay. Intermedial studies focus on interrelations among dissimilar media products and media types. In order to understand and conceptualize these interrelations, the notion of medium must be methodically scrutinized. I submit that the most relevant way of framing the notion of medium is to conceptualize it in terms of communication in a very broad sense, transfer of information or significance among people, including both one-way communication and two-way communication. My aim in this talk is to delineate a model of communication centered on the notion of medium. The goal is to put studies of mediality at large and the research of intermediality in particular within the broad frame of human mental interaction. Next. So this is the outline of my talk. First, why do you need yet another communication model? Then I will discuss and criticize a few earlier well-known communication models. And finally, I will present a sketch of a new medium-centered model of communication. So, there is no lack of communication models. For at least 65 years, researchers from various areas have tried to capture the essential entities of human exchange of information and signification. Many successful attempts to describe and analyze these entities have been made, and several of the most influential works have taken the form of novels. I will try to demonstrate that although several existing models capture most of the essential entities of communication in highly useful ways, some core aspects of communication have not been properly incorporated. These aspects, I argue, are best conceptualized in terms of mediality and with the aid of semiotics. They are vital for pinpointing basic media similarities and differences, and hence also the core of intermediality, understood as interrelations among dissimilar media. Next. So, I think we need a full-fledged communication model that clearly defines the basic entities of human communication and their interrelations, that covers not only speech and other verbal media types, but all sorts of media, that captures basic media dissimilarities vital for different communicative capacities, that, in order to achieve these goals, puts more emphasis on the intermediate stage of communication, often called channel, contact, or sometimes medium. I will now present and very briefly discuss the most fundamental features of a few already existing models. As it's impossible to cover all communication models that have seen the light of day, I have chosen 4 influential communication models from areas such as technology, linguistics, communication studies, and cultural studies. The ideas of which can be traced also in much later models. Whereas all these models aim at representing the basic traits of communication, they are created for partly different purposes. It's certainly not my goal to dismiss them as such. I have a deep respect for the scholars who form them, and I will actually use most of the substance in their models. Although I think there are several things that must be modified and clarified in order to create a truly broad model of communication. Next, please. So, my first example, a model presented by Claude Shannon in 1948, a mathematical theory of communication. Shannon distinctly declares that, quote, the fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point, either exactly or approximately, the message selected at another point. Frequently, the messages have meaning, that is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. These semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem, end quote. So, there's clearly a fundamental discrepancy between the engineering problem and the perspective from the humanities. Nevertheless, Shannon's model has been very influential also outside mathematical circles. It provides a useful analogy between the engineering perspective and a humanities viewpoint. So, what do we have here? First, to the left, an information source, I quote, which produces a message or sequence of messages to be communicated to the receiving terminal. And it's important to note that message here means data of various kinds that are quantifiable. It has nothing to do with meaning. And then, the transmitter, the technical device, quote, which operates on the message in some way to produce a signal suitable for transmission of the channel. And the channel is in the middle without having a description. Third, quote, the channel is merely the medium, Shannon writes, used to transmit the signal from transmitter to receiver. It may be a pair of wires, a coaxial cable, a band of radio frequencies, a beam of light, etc. And then we see the receiver, and quote, the receiver ordinarily performs the inverse operation of that done by the transmitter, reconstructing the message from the signal. And finally, to the right, the destination. And according to Shannon, the destination is the person or thing for whom the message is intended. We also see, however, noise source. And noise, according to Shannon, is at hand when the received signal is not necessarily the same as that sent out by the transmitter. And of course, noise is here understood purely as a technical phenomenon. Now, whereas the two entities, transmitter and receiver, and the signal between them, are not very useful, I think, for a model dealing with meaning. They become reductive, I would say. The other entities in this model are actually very well suited for adaptation to the humanities. In a paper published 1 year later, 1949, together with Shannon's original article, and to a large extent discussing it, Warren Weaver suggests a broad definition of communication as, quote, all the procedures by which one mind may affect another. This, of course, and it's still Weaver, involves not only written and oral speech, but also music, the pictorial arts, the theater, the ballet, and in fact all human behavior, end quote. This is really excellent. It fits my purpose perfectly. Alas, Weaver did not develop this broad perspective at all. His extension of Shannon's model is mainly restricted to speech, unfortunately. Next. The next example is a model created by Roman Jakobson from the article Linguistics and Poetics. Jakobson's aim is to investigate language in all the variety of its functions, as he writes. This exploration, he explains, demands a concise survey of the constitutive factors of any speech event in any act of verbal communication. And Jacobson explains, quote, the addressor sends a message to the addressee. To be operative, the message requires a context, seizable by the addressee, a code common to the addressor and addressee, or in other words, to the encoder and decoder of the message, and finally, a contact, a physical channel and psychological connection between the addressor and the addressee, enabling both of them to enter and stay in communication. End quote. I will not dwell on this model very long. I will simply say that there are two main flaws, according to me. The first is that Jacobson's model is designed only for verbal communication, so it's all about language. And another thing is that there are no serious efforts to define or discuss the basic entities at any level. It doesn't write much more than what I quoted recently. So let's hurry on to the next model by Wilbur Brown, a model from 1971 based on earlier efforts. Brown states that, quote, the communication process consists of information processing organized around a shared orientation to certain signs. And he says that the communication relationship includes three elements: the communicator, the message, and the receiver. So A, communicator, M, message, B, receiver. Fram argues that nothing really passes from A to B. A encodes a message as best he can in signs. B reads a message into those signs. It is just as meaningful to say that B acts on the signs as that they act on B. And that is why the arrow between M and B points in both directions. That is one of the main points of this model, I think. However, the main problem with Schramm's model is that it does not really scrutinize the notion of message. In spite of its merits, it becomes rather messy, I think. On the one hand, Schramm argues that nothing really passes from A to B. On the other hand, he says that it is messages, not ideas or thoughts, that pass from communicator to receiver. As a consequence, the message is confusingly understood both as something that is situated between communicator and receiver and as something that passes from communicator to receiver. I believe that Schramm conflates two entities that should be kept separate in a lucid model of communication. Finally then, next release. This is Stuart Hall's model from 1980. Hall argues convincingly, I think, that there are a few what he calls determinate moments in the complex communication systems. Both the moments of encoding and decoding and the message form. Although these determinate moments are part of what is called the social relations of the communication process as a whole, the message form and the moments of encoding and decoding must necessarily be highlighted, and this can be seen in Hall's visual diagram. So these are the entities that cannot be dismissed according to Hall if one wants to understand communication. The three entities in the upper part of the diagram. And as one can see, the moments of encoding and decoding are also called meaning structures 1, meaning structures 2. And the central entity in this model is called, well, according to the diagram, it says program as a meaningful discourse. And that's because he mainly discusses television programs. So you can skip the program and say that the central entity is meaningful discourse. In his text, however, Hall varies his terminology considerably. He writes about the central entity as, quote, the objects of communication, or, quote, meanings and messages in the form of sign vehicles organized through the operation of codes within the syntagmatic chain of discourse. Or, quote again, symbolic vehicles constitute within the rules of language, or message form, or encoded messages in the form of meaningful discourse, discourse form, and so on. So he's really bad at making up his mind about what to call these different entities. So a few problems with Hall's model, according to me, is that he actually uses the term message in relation to all three determinate moments, which partly makes his text a bit obscure. Another problem is that he focuses on television and yet emphasizes that communication is inscribed into the discursive rules of language. So he writes a lot about code, encoding, decoding, reading, television, and so forth. I, on the other hand, argue that meaning is about much more than symbolic codes and language. There are also signs of similarity, icons, and signs of contiguity, indexes, that create meaning. So I can agree with Hall only part when he states that, quote, iconic signs are coded signs too, even if the codes here work differently from those of other signs, end quote. I think he's right to the extent that there are probably no pure icons. Nevertheless, the core of iconic meaning production, by way of similarity, is, I submit, something fundamentally different from the core of symbolic meaning production, based on habit or convention, and cannot be hidden behind the notion of code, because code has so much to do with language, symbols, convention. Okay, next please. So now my brand new attempt to modify a little bit these earlier influential models. As you have noticed, they are rather old, but to the best of my knowledge, newer communications model more or less built on the same ideas. So not very much has happened actually during the last decades, I think. So my attempt to a new medium-centered model of communication, it is supposed to be a model of the smallest possible combination of entities of communication. So if one of the entities in the model is removed, there is no longer communication at hand, I would say. It's thus an irreducible model, to quote the words of that were used in a workshop the other day. So the smallest possible combination of entities, so to speak. And I start with one-way communication. And the three interrelated, indispensable entities in communication can be discerned thus as: one, something being transferred. Two separate places between which the transfer occurs. Places meaning not only physical space, but perhaps also mental spaces. Let's see what that is. And three, an intermediate stage that makes the transfer possible. So I argue that if you take away one of these entities, bye-bye communication. Now, how are these entities circumscribed in the earlier models? We start with one, something being transferred. Cannon calls it the message, in the sense of computable data. Jacobson also calls it message, but his notion is not really circumscribed. Schramm says that either nothing or messages are being transferred, with an emphasis that it's not ideas or thoughts that are being transferred. Hall finally, it's really good today. He implies that meaning is transferred. It's never written out directly, but it's implied, I think. Meaning is transferred. However, meaning structures 1 and meaning structures 2, as we remember from the model, may not be the same. Hall emphasizes that there are degrees of symmetry, degrees of understanding and misunderstanding. So, transfer always entails transformation, and that's fine. I think that is very important to remember. No transfer without transformation. The second point, 2 separate places between which the transfer occurs. This is easy. Shannon calls it information source, destination. Jacobson writes about addressor, addressee. Brown writes about communicator, receiver. And Hall about encoding, meaning structures 1, decoding, meaning structures 2. And importantly, I think it's implied that these activities in Hall's model take place in mental spaces. 3, an intermediate stage that makes the transfer possible. Here, Shannon writes about channel, or what he actually once calls medium, and it's something material. That's all. Something material. Jacobson calls it the contact. As I quoted before, a physical channel and psychological connection between the addresser and the addressee, enabling both of them to enter and stay in communication. Schramm calls the middle entity message. And as I noted, although Schramm does not really scrutinize the notion of what he calls the message, it is sometimes understood as something that is transferred rather than transferred through. It is described in terms of a material entity, for instance, a letter that you put in the mailbox. An old-fashioned letter. Or a paper that you put in the mailbox. Yes, a letter, but Schramm also writes about the entity in the middle as a collection of signs. Hall finally calls the central entity of communication meaningful discourse, and as we have noted, his terminology is rather incoherent when it comes to this. No, it's not over there, sorry. I don't have to point at it. Okay, it's a little bit inconsistent. Now, how do I circumscribe these 3 entities? So now it's at last my turn to decide. If we start with something being transferred, I think that there's certainly a point in Schramm's notion that ideas or thoughts are not transferred in communication. As Hall emphasizes, transfer of meaning always entails transformation. It may certainly be the case that the ideas resulting from communication may be very different from those that were put into it. Nevertheless, I am convinced that models of communication cannot do without the notion of something being transferred. If there is no correlation at all between input and output, there is simply no communication. To communicate is, as we remember, to share. However problematic it may be, the notion of something being transferred must be kept and painstakingly scrutinized instead of being avoided. It's clear that the transferred entities certainly cannot be confined to distinct and conscious intentions, and perhaps not even to ideas, as Schramm understands. So my suggestion is rather simply is to use terms such as cognitive import to refer to those mental configurations that are the input and output of communication. Whereas the notion of cognitive import is clearly closely related to notions such as meaning, ideas, and thought. Perhaps the term as such may work in a little bit more neutral way, so to speak. Two separate places between which the transfer occurs. As I find it very important to be able to connect mind and body to different entities of the communication model, I think it's imperative to avoid crude notions like Jakobson's addresser, addressee, and Schramm's communicator-receiver, easily giving the impression that the transfer necessarily occurs between two persons consisting of minds and bodies, and with a third separate intermediate and middle, so to speak. It's more correct, I believe, to circumscribe the two places in terms of all notions of encoding meaning structures 1, decoding meaning structures 2, suggesting that these activities take place in mental spaces. However, I want to avoid the term encoding and decoding. Now, Weaver's description of communication as something occurring between one mind and another is, to my mind, simple and right to the point. So my suggestion is to use the terms producer's mind, perceiver's mind, to refer to the mental places where cognitive import appears. First, there are some mental configurations in the producer's mind, and then, after the transfer, there are mental configurations in the perceiver's mind that are at least remotely similar to the ones in the producer's mind. And 3, the intermediate stage that makes the transfer possible. My general idea is that this intermediate stage has been under-theorized. Nevertheless, most researchers that I refer to either explicitly or implicitly recognize that the intermediate stage is in some way material. Schramm and Hall furthermore clearly discussed it in terms of science. In line with this, I argue that the intermediate entity that connects two minds with each other is always in some way material, although it clearly cannot be conceptualized only in terms of materiality. As it connects two minds, it must be understood as materiality having the capacity of triggering certain mental responses. So my suggestion is to use the term media product to refer to the intermediate entity or stage that makes possible the transfer of cognitive import from a producer's mind to a perceiver's mind. And it's important to remember here, this is one of my main points I think, that the media product may be realized by either non-bodily or bodily matter or matter emanating directly from the body. This means that the producer's mind may, for instance, use either non-bodily matter, say a written letter, or her own body and its immediate extensions, speech and gestures, for instance, to realize the media product. So me standing here is both a producer's mind and the intermediate entity. I'm also a media product right now. The term medium has been used before in communication models, of course, but to the best of my knowledge, it has not so far been tied to any developed notions. So, the fun part of the problem. So this is the very first outline of visual diagram that I'm sure that it will be modified in many ways, so I will be extremely grateful if you can give me ideas about it. If it works in the wrong way to your minds, so to speak. So if we follow this diagram from left to right, we start with having some cognitive import in the producer's mind, mental configurations of some sort. I'm being very vague here because there are so many things that can be transferred, but it's always in the mind. So some mental configuration. Then we have an act of a transfer of cognitive import through an act of production. And production must be understood as a very, very broad concept, including all kinds of different entities such as conception, formation, creation, and often also stages of storage, where what we produce is, so to speak, fixed in some way, and then it can later on be picked up and further transferred to the media product. And the media product in the middle then is the entity that the cognitive import passes through, so to speak. And once the cognitive import has passed through the media product, an act of perception starts. A transfer of cognitive import through an act of perception. And perception is, in principle, always, I think, followed by and entangled with interpretation. So there's certainly no pure perception followed by pure interpretation. They always entangle, but in some way it starts with perception. See something, or we hear something, or we feel something, or smell something. Finally, then the cognitive import. Finally, then there is some cognitive import in the perceiver's mind. Some mental configurations in the perceiver's mind, which must have some sort of similarity to the mental configuration in the producer's mind. And as we well understand, it's not a question of the cognitive import being actually transferred. It's a complicated process of new cognitive import created with the aid of the media product, and with some luck there will be some sort of similarity so that communication actually occurs. Now, a few words about the acts of production and perception. While there is certainly a similarity to channels, entities, transmitter and receiver, the transfer of cognitive import often involves a complex and entangled corporeal and cognitive The transfer of cognitive import often involves complex and entangled corporeal and cognitive processes that cannot properly be reduced to analogies of mechanical processes, as Weaver suggests. Furthermore, while in an engineering context, it may well be true that, quoting Weaver, the receiver is a sort of inverse transmitter, changing the transmitted signal back into a message. End quote. The act of perception cannot accurately be described as an inverse act of production. For instance, also the act of production, as a rule, actually involves acts of perception and interpretation of the emerging media product. The painter, for instance, being on her way to paint the painting, creating media product, of course, she perceives what she's producing, and so production is also about perception from the producer's point of view, so to speak. So it's not simply an inverse act. Both production and perception are processes that have quite a lot in common. So next, please. I think it's important to note that media products always need what I call technical media to be realized. And the technical media, when you hear me say technical media, it should be understood as technical media of display or technical media of distribution of sensory configuration. So it's all about, well, it's the interface between media products and perceiver, so to speak. I think that the distinction between media product and technical medium is needed to be able to see the difference between and mutual interdependence. For instance, a television program and a television set. Sometimes a technical medium of display, like a TV set, may actually realize several different media products, many TV products. So although there are no media products without technical media, I think it's important to see that there's a certain theoretical difference. And as I have implied, there are internal technical media, bodies, parts of bodies, or physical phenomena emanating directly from the body, and or external technical media, non-bodily devices like screens, ink on paper, and so forth. I furthermore state that all media products can be analyzed in terms of four kinds of basic media traits, what I refer to as media modalities. Some of you have perhaps read a paper of mine discussing these, so I will present it rather briefly. I think that the media product, the entity in the middle, as I have stated, must be understood both as material and as mantle. I prefer to call the three first modalities three semiotic modalities that are concerned with mediation. I call them the material modality, the sensorial modality, and the spatial-temporal modality. And these modalities are to be understood as categories of media traits. So each and every medium can be realized in terms of, for instance, a certain material mode being consisting of, for instance, solid materiality or non-solid materiality. Every media product may be realized in terms of one or several modes of the sensorial modality, being visual or auditory or audiovisual. Every media product is also realized by way of at least one spatial-temporal modality, being temporal, two-dimensional spatial, three-dimensional spatial, or combinations of these modes. And on top of that, we then have the semiotic modality, and semiotics is about representation, creating meaning. So the material sensorial aspect, they are the necessary ground, so to speak, which we cannot do without. And as soon as they enter into our minds, they become semiotic entities, but they are not semiotic as such, so to speak. That's why I call them pre-semiotic. Now, the semiotic modality, I prefer to conceptualize it in terms of Charles Sanders Peirce's famous trichotomy. So the three main modes of the semiotic modality is then iconicity, based on similarity, indexicality, based on ambiguity, and symbolicity, based on habits or conventions. Now, although perception of the mediated traits is clearly connected to the perceiver's mind, representation is even more a result of mind work. And what we take to be represented media characteristics, for instance, motives, themes, structures, narrative content, etc., are always results of both the fundamental traits of the media product as such, the mediated traits, and of cognitive activity, resulting in representation. While signification is ultimately about mind work, this mind work is, in the case of communication, fundamentally dependent on the physical appearance of the media product. Now, some signification is more dependent on and inseparable from the physical appearance of the media product than other. For instance, iconic qualities emanating directly from the mediated physical appearance of the media product, such as a detailed drawing of the face. This is an example of where the actual physical appearance is much closer to the way we present it. It's a longer way between the symbolic sign and the interpreted in the mind. Next, please. I am planning to talk for 45 minutes, so I think we'll finish in about 5, 6, or 7 minutes. So, some additional remarks on this model, this work in progress. First, code. Many researchers rely heavily on the notion of code. The dichotomy encoding-decoding is very popular in communication models. I think this is a problem, as the notion works primarily for language, symbolic signs. So one of my most important points, for me at least, is to say that the perspective must be extended to other kinds of signification, including iconicity and indexicality. Talking about encoding and decoding give the wrong clues. Another notion that has become very popular in different kinds of communication studies is the notion of noise, emanating from Shannon's mathematical model. And Shannon's notion of noise has been picked up by very many researchers. And it is clearly relevant also for communication involving meaning or cognitive input. For instance, speech can clearly be disturbed by other sounds, by noise. But this is noise, but noise in this ordinary sense occurs in both the act of production and the act of perception. So that's why I made like these. There are so many different kinds of elements involved in production and perception, so many things that can go wrong that are of material kinds. Simply. So if you make a drawing, you may run out of paint, perhaps, and then you can't create the media product that you intended to. So there are many things that might go wrong, that maybe the communication may be disturbed with noise in this traditional sense. Now, the problem with the notion of noise applied to communication of meaning or cognitive import is that it implies that complete absence of noise would bring about complete transfer of cognitive import. There would be no transformation, no misunderstanding. The result would be identity between the cognitive import of the producers and the perceiver's mind. And this is clearly not the case, I submit. It may be the case in a technological context where absolute absence of noise results in clear communication, clear transfer of computable data. But the analogy doesn't work for communication models dealing with meaning of cognitive import. And the technological notion of noise is simply not enough for understanding the communication of cognitive import. So it must thus be emphasized that there is not only external noise or internal noise created by imperfect material conditions. Clearly, many exceedingly complex factors are involved when the perceiver's mind forms cognitive import. And my proposed model highlights at least one crucial factor, and that is that there are inbuilt physical delimitations, so to speak, in each media type, depending on which media type it belongs to. Media have partly similar and partly dissimilar material, sensorial, spatio-temporal, and furthermore semiotic traits. And the combination of traits, to a large extent, although not completely, determines what kind of cognitive input can be transferred from producer to perceiver. To give you an easy example, clearly a piece of music, a media product, a piece of music, can only partly transfer the same sort of cognitive input as, say, a photograph or a poem. So that's why I have put this sign of disturbance also in the media product. And it's not really disturbance, it's of course not noise in Shannon's sense, but nevertheless it's intended to refer to the limitations and possibilities of each kind of media product. So these crucial inbuilt barriers for complete communication, so to speak, have largely been neglected in earlier communication models. I argue that the multimodal and intermedial approach to communication, emphasizing the decisive pre-semiotic and semiotic similarities and differences among media types, adds an indispensable capacity to understand and analyze the transformative nature of communication, far beyond the blunt noise, far beyond the blunt notion of noise. Finally, I will spend my last minutes by way of presenting a few possible and perhaps necessary developments of this proposed model. Some other issues that can only be extremely briefly touched upon here. So it might be described as a few possible expansions of the smallest possible combination of entities of communication that have been sketched so far. So the first and perhaps most obvious development would be the things that Hall is especially interested in. He distinctly emphasizes, quote, the social relations of the communication process as a whole. And this is an important aspect that has not so far been captured in the proposed model. I think it's clear to see that there are so many things having to do with society, history, hermeneutic issues, context, pre-understanding, expectations, beliefs, values, and so forth, that must somehow go into this model. So one way would, of course, be to write a lot of things here with arrows pointing to the producer's mind, pointing to the receiver's mind, indicating that the minds are so much influenced by surrounding factors. My other developments have to do with more narrow things, so to speak. So one kind of development would be to say that producer and or perceiver are several minds. In some instances, obviously, there are several minds working together. For instance, when you make a movie, several minds involved creating the media product, and then there are several minds as perceivers. So that's one way of expanding the model. Another way is to say that the first perceiver becomes a producer who creates a new media product, the same sort or of another sort, that is perceived by a new perceiver. And that would create, of course, a communicative chain. And certainly communication is always about lots and lots and lots of links between producers and the perceivers. And my last suggested development is to say that the first perceiver becomes a producer who creates a new media product that is perceived by the initial producer. And that is, of course, two-way communication, often conceptualized as feedback. And by the same token, you can go on and expand, add things and so forth. But this would be, according to my mind, the irreducible elements of communication model. So I will stop here rather abruptly without any conclusion to give place to discussion and hopefully a few questions. So, thanks for your
Thank you for your lecture. Thank you, Lars, for sharing your new model with us. So, anyone, I think also you can make questions in Portuguese if you want, and we'll try to translate.
Thank you, Lars, for your lecture. Well, I have many questions, but let me ask you, what's more, well, I'm sorry, what is mind according to your model? As a model maker, I suppose you are working in a specific framework, general theoretical framework, so I would like to ask you this basic question.
I know you are very good at first, and I like first too. And now you're trying to trick me into a discussion of the Persian notion of man, which is very complicated, and I must say that I have never quite understood Percy's points of view there. So my answer would be that it is well, rather scientific. I have a rather scientific view of it. Mind is simply well, let us say the conscious and unconscious activities going on in our brains, simply. So the entity that covers cognitions, emotions, as I said, the conscious and the unconscious and so forth. So the basis of life that knows that life, so to speak. So that's kind of the only answer I can give this in the head. So,
This one question? Can I? Well, I would like to ask you, so one more question. I haven't mentioned very briefly, but I would like to ask you something about the problem of meaning. One of the biggest problems, the channel mathematical approach is related to semantic and pragmatic dimension of information processing or communication processing. And I would like to ask you, considering your model, how do you approach this problem, the same problem, dimension, pragmatic dimension?
I think I do basically the same as the other researchers that I refer to. I recognize the problem and then I try to avoid it. No, but for the moment I have chosen the term cognitive import, just in order to escape the term meaning. Because according to my experience, as soon as you use this term that refers to so many different notions, you get into trouble because there are not two persons who have the same idea about what meaning is. So, by way of talking about it in terms of cognitive import, I simply want to point to the fact that mental configurations, what goes on in the mind, so to speak, and it doesn't have to be meaningful in the strong sense that it makes sense, that it's possible to understand and describe in a definite way, so to speak. It can also be more fuzzy things going on, more vague thoughts and ideas and so forth. And I think that perhaps traditional communication models, especially formed within the area of communication and media communication, communication service often want to emphasize that the entity being transferred, it must be rather clear in one way or another, because if you study mass media, mass communication and so forth, you want to have a concept that is well, possible to handle, so to speak, and they are interested in describing effects of communication and so forth, and then it's not enough with having vague sensations and so forth in the head. So, but in the context of well, art and humanities, on the other hand, it's important to emphasize that what can be transferred between minds is not only clear-cut ideas that are intended and so forth. There can be much more well, complicated and deep, perhaps, important notions, ideas about life and experience and so forth that cannot be clearly verbalized. So those things must also be part of the framework of communication. I think if we should be talking about communication, of course, I know that some people will say that communication is a term that gives you completely wrong ideas. So that's why I said in the beginning, like one-way communication or expression. To me, it's not really important to use the term communication. The main thing for me is to try to frame this act of some sort of transfer from one mind to another.
Lars, first of all, congrats for this brilliant presentation that we are all stimulated to rethink many concepts. Look, I've been looking at a sort of a diagram here and I could not solve something. That is, you mentioned there is this phenomenon, something being transferred, and a transformation. And you also call that sharing. So I immediately thought about the phenomenon of poeticity. How do we deal with that? Poeticity.
Poeticity.
Yeah. How do we deal with this lack of communication, this deliberate erasure of this conventional communication, and also there's this deliberate noise in the artistic discourse. So how could we measure or under which terms we take the word transformation and sharing according to your perspective?
Yeah. I don't know if I can give you a very good answer, but it is always in my mind when I think about this, that these transformational processes, both in the case of communication simply, well, traffic between one mind and another, and also in cases of media transformation, when you have one kind of media product such as a novel, and someone transfers it into a different medium. That's another kind of transfer. I could add a lot of things here, but I will not do it today. So my main point would be, I think that there are, on the one hand, definite restrictions in media as such. You cannot transfer anything through any kind of media. So there are certainly restrictions. But on the other hand, we also choose our restrictions. And that's of course when, for instance, poetry comes in. You don't want this clear-cut intentional message, perhaps, if you don't write political poetry, perhaps. You want something to get through to the reader, but not the complete picture, so to speak. So that's of course the producer manipulates the media product, I guess, in a way that something is being transferred and other things are kept up. And those are very complicated things, of course, but yeah, it's part of the physical limitations and things that you do of your own with so to speak. That's a very important thing.
Hi, so thank you for your presentation. And several models in the beginning of the talk, and it seems like your choice was to be more economical than both models, something. And I think it seems like a very good choice to be more economical.
Sorry,
it seems like a good choice to be more economical and with the minimal amount of elements possible. But it seems to me that when we take out the other elements, it seems to me like we are going in the direction to versus basic model. So I think it's really similar to the notion of object, sign, and interpretant being interconnected and communicating some form through the sign to the interpretant, which is the effect on the interpreter's mind. So my question would be, do you think there is a fundamental different assumption in your model, or is it just is it just aimed at a different discussion at a different community?
Yeah. No, to my mind, there is. I really hope that this kind of modeling communication is compatible with the sign systems of PERS, because if it's not, I have failed entirely, definitely. But when you make visual diagrams, you have to be very economical. You know? So if you try to put in too much, it becomes a mess, and it creates more problem than it solves. So, but obviously, yeah, sure. I mean, this entity always being material in some kind can certainly be described as the sign or the representation in process model, and those the object and the interpretant would be in the perceiver's mind. So the object somewhere in the perceiver's mind, because the object is always something that we already know in some way according to the sign. It's always a mental aspect referring to another mental aspect. So this would be a material sign creating a mental sign referring to a mental object, and this cognitive import would then be the interpretant, I would say, the result, so to speak. So just put the three sign constituents into the perceiver's mind, and I think it's fine and satisfying. This is dangerous.
Thank you for this. I have a question. Despite being mind, entity that holds conscious and unconscious processes, as you told us, don't you think mind itself is language?
No.
Why not?
No, I refuse to talk about it. Well, I think that one of, I don't hesitate that it's almost a disaster in 20th century thinking about, well, meaning, media, and the arts and so forth. The linguistic impact from Saussure semiological model have not been very healthy, I would think, because it reduces all those things going on in our minds that cannot be verbalized to something that, well, doesn't exist. And that's, of course, one reason for avoiding the notion of meaning, that it is so much associated with, well, cognitive structures that may be verbalized. And Jakobson also actually writes that, I didn't quote it now, but he writes that the context must be possible to verbalize in some way. So the context around language for Jakobson is only verbalizable entity, so to speak. And I think it's plainly wrong. Listening to music, for instance, or well, why not when we read poetry and so forth? There's so much going on, so many important things created in our minds that cannot be clearly verbalized. And that's the whole point. It's another kind of meaning, if you wish. So if you try to subsume those other kinds of cognitive import or meaning, you reduce everything that is not language. So, yeah, thanks. Of course, the problem is that language is such a good communicative device that we cannot talk about these things without using language, and that's a silly paradox, but that's how it is.
First of all, good afternoon, thank you for your explanation.
There behind.
Is there something related between your model and the actor-network theory? You heard about it?
I don't know.
And when you say about a material sign creating a mental sign, so humans and non-human actors acting in a communication model. So during all your presentation, I think there's something related between your model and actor-network theory.
Yeah.
So is that something real?
Yeah.
Do you think about it?
Right. My simple answer would be that I don't, as yet, know enough about it to give a certain answer. What I do know is that when you look around and I try to read articles from various disciplines and so forth, and of course these entities tend to come back in one way or another all the time, and that's the same with, I would say, with the sign constituents of purse, that even if you don't refer to purse, the entities tend to come back in some way or another, and that's, I would say, a proof of that it's something we can do that we cannot escape. So of course it would be good if I could give you a long list of references saying that I have taken everything into consideration, so to speak, but not yet. So, but please send me some ideas about articles that I can take a look at. Thank you.
I think we don't have more time, and I think we don't have more questions. So, do you have one more question? Okay. I think so. Yeah.
According to the definition of cognitivism or internalism, paradigm in cognitive science, agents are distinct in time and space, and they are living in a very structured environment, and they are manipulating very stable structures. Not sign as action or processes, very stable structures. It's something that is transferred from some point to another point. I would like to know how your model is in dialogue with this very big picture for people are. That's my question.
Yeah, sure. Again, I'll try to escape your question. No, but what I do when I think about this is to set up certain limitations. So I simply, at least for the moment, I confine myself to human minds and things going on in our heads that describe in terms of cognition. So I'm well aware of the fact that this can or should perhaps be construed in a way that also animals are doing, and perhaps even beyond the animals. Yes, that's possible, certainly. And perhaps emotions and interpretance in terms of actions rather than words. Yes, perhaps. But that would be too much for me right now. So I'll start with this, and then if readers or listeners say that, okay, it can be expanded, I will not say no. But those expansions may create problems that I'm not ready to deal with. Yes. So, thank you. Thank you a lot.